More so now.
I have two that can, bro. Once I fix it, it'll be fine. If I was less lazy, it would be perfectly fine. I'm fine with the fact that you can't. Yes.
We will now be increasing engine RPM to 2,500, and we will be recording our O2 upstream and downstream activity. Now we will be conducting our simulation test, where we will introduce a small misfire condition to increase emissions and observe catalyst outlet temperature and downstream O2 response. You see in our graph, we get our downstream, which gives a very big voltage drop, and then it rises back to about 0.6, 0.7 volts, where it tries to level out. And as you can see in our upstream, we get a little bit of a spike meant by lower voltage, and it fluctuates back and forth. And now I will be getting a reading of the catalyst at the outlet. At the outlet of our catalytic converter, which is about here, gives us a reading of about 330, and it fluctuates back and forth.
Okay, so now we're going over our discussion and analysis section. So first question, how do the O2 sensors confirm the operation of the catalytic converter? They do this by looking at how fast the upstream and downstream sensor are switching. And if it's operating properly, the upstream sensor will switch at a high rate and the downstream sensor will switch at a low rate. And if the catalytic converter isn't working properly, then they'll both switch at similar rates.
And for question 2 of our discussion and analysis, we will be describing if our catalytic converter is working correctly and how do we know. We know our catalytic converter is working correctly in our vehicle due to our upstream sensor switching at a very fast rate between lean and rich conditions, with a value between 0.1 volts to 0.9 volts. We get a reading of about 0.35 volts to about 0.89 volts for meters in specification. That is working correctly. Our downstream sensor fluctuates at a very steady rate and does not too much move from its voltage standard. We know that our CAT is working because both of our sensors are switching in different fashions, and if they were not working, they would be switching in similar fashions.
Okay, now we're doing question 3. And question 3 is, how does a PCM decide to set a P0420 or P0430 code for our vehicle? So I'm doing P0420, and that code would set if you have a faulty three-way catalyst, an exhaust gas leak, or a faulty O2 sensor. Now I'll hand it off to Charlie and he'll do the other code.
For P0430, in all they do, there is no specific DTC information or specification on why a P0430 code was set on our specific car and our specific manufacturer.
Okay, so now it's time for the conclusion section. So this was my first time testing for upstream and downstream exhaust temperatures. It was interesting, like having to look at inlet and outlet temperatures. At first I was having some issues using the temperature gun because I was, like, when I was taking the reading, I had to get really close to the catalytic converter, and if I wasn't keeping my hand steady with the temp gun, it wasn't reading quite correctly. So I had some learning curves right there. Yeah, I eventually figured it out and got my readings. And other than that, we had to go back and get the inlet and outlet temperatures because on one of the videos we filmed, we mislabeled like which one was which. So we kind of switched it up. So we had to go back and, you know, redo that. But the most interesting part of the lab to me was seeing how the misfire drastically affected the downstream O2 sensor graph. Like, it just really just altered the voltage, and I thought that was pretty cool. So now I'll hand it off to Charlie.
And I would say for our catalytic converter efficiency, and this being the first lab for our emissions-based course, I feel this is a good intro into learning how to read like graphs, especially when it comes to HO2 sensors and how they fluctuate, especially with how they switch using the scan tools. And I felt that sometimes it was a little bit of a challenge and we had some learning curves, especially when getting heat temperatures or in just general, finding the correct placement for us to actually get our actual temperature fluctuations and for us to properly read the O2 sensors. But in general, I feel this lab was almost very much a good learning experience for emissions, and I can't wait to see what the next lab brings.
Thank you for watching.